Good morning and welcome to the meeting of the San Diego Metropolitan Transit System Budget Development Committee. I am your chair, Vivian Moreno. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Good morning. Just a reminder to please turn on your microphone when you are speaking. Moreno,
Present.
Elo Rivera,
Present.
Coble,
Present.
McCann, Whitburn.
Here.
We have a quorum, Chair.
Thank you, clerk. Moving on to item number 2, which is public comment. Clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to comment?
We have no public comments.
Thank you. Moving on to item number 3, it's the approval of the minutes for our meeting on March 2nd, 2023. Clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to comment?
We have no public comments.
Thank you. We do need a motion and a second to approve the minutes. So if I may have a motion?
So moved.
Wonderful. Committee member, right?
Gone. Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, we have a motion. May I have a second?
Second.
Okay, for Councilmember Goble.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a second. All those in motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? This motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We are going to move on to committee discussion items. Item number 4 is a report from the Executive Director of the California Transportation Association, Mr. Michael Pimentel. And we will be hearing this item at the next budget committee. I thought it was a very important item that we wanted to discuss in regards to funding from our state capital. And we will be hearing that at the next budget meeting. And so we are going to move on to item number 5, which is fiscal year 2024 operation budget discussion. And we have Mr. Thompson, please take it away.
Good morning, Mike Thompson. I'm the Director of Financial Planning Analysis. I'm joined by Gordon Meyer, who's our Operating Budget Supervisor. We just really want to quickly start with our budget development process. So every year we do use a zero-based budgeting process. And in a traditional historical budgeting process, managers only justify variances year over year, but we make every manager justify every single dollar every year. So in these presentations, we typically talk about the changes. We just wanted to remind you that we do build this up from $0. That process begins in January, where the budget team meets with the management of every discipline in the organization, review the current expense trends. Then we also justify all of the items in their budget and roll up a mid-year number as well as the next fiscal year number. So today we're presenting a draft of the fiscal year 24 operating budget. We are still finalizing some assumptions, so there is some numbers that will be changing, but this is a fairly complete draft compared to what we presented to the committee last time. We will start with our revenue assumptions on the sales tax side. Transnet is a half-cent regional sales tax in San Diego region. That is administered by Sandag, so they set the targets every year and divvy up the funding as well. And we have this chart on the right of the screen that sort of breaks down how that fund is allocated. So there's a target for next year of $430 million. That's a 1% growth for next year over current year target. Then there's 17.7 million taken off the top, and the remainder of those cash receipts are allocated by this formula. The blue line is the major corridors program, things that are built by Sandag, like Midcoast, for example. That's 42% of the funding. 33% of the funding is the local system roads that goes directly to the cities and the county for their road repairs. So the parts that are budget relevant are this maroon slice down here. It's 8%. That is the new operations funding. So anything that Sandag builds for the region that we operate and North County operates, they fund it through that slice of the pie. So for next year, we are having reimbursement for our BAT routes, our super loop routes, and also the Midcoast trolley operations. And the expected cost recovery is about 30.7 million that's built into the budget. The last slice of this pie is the transit system improvements, and that's straight formula funding that comes to the transit operators. So it's whatever cash receipt comes to the door, we get our fair share of that. And then whatever that bucket is, it's split between North County and MTS based on population. It's typically right around a 70-30 split. So that pool is projected to be about 68 million next year, but no matter what cash comes in the door, we get our fair share of that. So the MTS piece in the operating budget is 42 million for operations, and there's 5 million that offsets fair discounts in there as well. The next sales tax revenue we want to discuss is the Transportation Development Act, or TDA. This is a statewide tax. It's a quarter-cent sales tax of the overall 7% sales tax. Sandag forecasts this as well and apportions this amount each year. This revenue source has a claim process. So whatever the budget is set up at the beginning of the year, we submit a claim for that amount, and then we basically get that amount no matter what. If the cash receipts come in higher or lower, there's a reserve at the county level that sort of balances that out. So for next year's growth, because it's going from one claim to the next claim, it's actually 3.2%, growth year over year. So that means a total regional pool of 206 million almost. MTS share is about 136 million. Now, this is a revenue stream that we share between capital and operations, and it's really a function of how much capital is in, how much federal capital and how much federal is in operations. And then there's sort of matching formula that goes on that sort of splits it between the two. So over this next fiscal year, we're projecting about $93 million in the operating budget and $42.7 million in the capital budget. The next sales tax revenue is state transit assistance. These is revenues derived across the state based on diesel fuel sales. So this funding is administered by the state controller's office. They make the projections every year. It is actually subject to the legislative budget process. So once that budget is set, typically not until late June, then we'll sort of know what our amount is, but we get a forecast in January every year, and we've built that into this budget. Historically, this had been a very volatile funding source because it had to go through the legislative process. Over the last few years, it has been much more stable, but because of our history, we've always included most of this funding in the capital program. So we've only put $11.3 million in the operating budget, and that was to fund service restorations over the FY13, FY18 timeframes, is very specific things. We've kept that amount static since then. It's 11.3 million, and the remainder will be in the capital budget again this year. Moving on to our federal revenues, these are come through the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA. The latest reauthorization was back in December of 2021, the bipartisan infrastructure law. And if you look at the chart on the right of the screen, you can see how that new legislation did increase the funding coming to MTS. Typically before, we were about $80 million in federal revenue, and you can see last year it bumped up over $100 million, and this year for federal fiscal year 24 is going to be closer to $108 million. So that is basically our formula funding that comes to MTS. This funding can be used in operating or capital budgets, but on the operating side, it can only be used for preventive maintenance activities. So every year we look at our preventive maintenance activities, see how much funding we can program against, how much is federal funding we can program for that. And we budget based on that in the operating budget, and the remainder will go into capital. But we also had a program in place where we wanted to keep capital whole and not just keep putting federal dollars in the operating budget. So for the last 10 years or so, we've been backfilling any additional any additional federal dollars in the operating budget with TDA. So that's how that revenue sharing formula between the federal and TDA sort of changes on both sides. It's a couple different things moving there, and it just trying to keep capital whole while also trying to keep as much federal in the operating budget as possible for cash flow purposes, because we can draw that right away. So for this next fiscal year, we are increasing the operating budget federal share by 3.4 million. But again, we'll swap some TDA back into capital to offset that. Other subsidy revenues, we do receive fast track revenue through Sandag. This is a toll revenue from the I-15 managed lanes, and we get about $1 million every year to fund our rapid express services up and down the I-15. Those are routes 280 and 290. And for the last few years, Sandag has also been giving us fast track revenue in lieu of Transnet operating reimbursement dollars, the funding thing on their side, just to help them out. Last year, it was 4.5 million of fast track came to MTS for that purpose. Next year, into fiscal 24, it will only be $2.5 million. But whatever that number is, additional Transnet will be replacing that number, so it keeps MTS whole. So in total, fast track revenue for next fiscal year will be $3.5 million. And we do have some other local state and local sources of revenue. It's about $1 million, basically unchanged year over year for those other minor things. Moving on to our operating revenues, starting with passenger revenue. We presented this at the last committee meeting and last board meeting as well. Our forecast growth is still 11% for next fiscal year. It's about $8 million in revenue growth. February's revenue number came in almost exactly where we expected it to be. It was off by just a few $1,000s. So we haven't seen anything to really change this number yet, but we want to look at March's revenue number and see what that comes in at. And then before we finalize this revenue assumption. So today we're presenting the same thing, but next meeting we'll have more information on March and then have a more detailed assumption behind this revenue number. Other operating revenues, again, it's a variety of miscellaneous things. We break it into 4 main categories, energy credits being the largest one, advertising, our real estate related revenues, and then other revenues. You can see in total, we're increasing by about $800,000. A large portion of that is in energy credits. We talked about the energy credit prices at the last meeting. We're keeping those same very low assumptions in place for next fiscal year. The market has not changed. We're still at $70 for the state credits and $2 for the federal credits. So that piece isn't changing. But we have a new supplier for natural gas, and MTS will be generating a lot more credits starting in January of this year. And then you analyze that in next year, just those so many more credits is generating more revenue next year. We'll see about $1.5 million increase in that line just from the amount of credits we're generating. And hopefully we do see some movement on the prices because our prices are still very low compared to historical norms. So if we get some better movement there, we could even see even more revenue in this line item. The other major change for this bucket is advertising revenue. It's decreasing by about $500,000. We had a green line naming rights agreement that expired in December of last year. So that will not have any impact in FY24, and we had some revenue in FY23's number. So that number will come down. All the other revenue sources are fairly consistent with the current fiscal year. So rolling up our revenue summary, operating revenue is growing by about $8.9 million or 9.6%. Majority of that is in passenger revenue. On the subsidy side, it's increasing only by $1.8 million or 0.7%. You can see total federal is increasing by $3.9 million. And then TDA is actually coming down by about $5 million as we do that balancing act between capital and operations. Our Transnet formula funding is increasing by 1%, $400,000. Transnet operating reimbursement is increasing by $4.3 million. Again, part of that is this $2 million swap from fast track that is going away, increasing that number and lowering the fast track number. So in total, it's $10.7 million of additional revenue next year or 3.1% increase over the amended budget. Talk about service levels real quick before we move on to the expenses. This is basically the same service levels that we presented at the preliminary FY24 presentation on the rail side and on the bus fixed route side. There was some discussion about maybe not adding that service back. As of right now, that service level is built into this budget. So we do plan on having hiring increasing and retention increasing to be able to add that. But and we've always tried to put as much service on the street as possible. It's always been the goal. So that's why that was built into there. And you can see the chart. We did bring service levels down this current fiscal year to deal with the operator shortages. And then we did plan on adding it back mostly in January of next year. So then FY25 would be even higher because it would be annualization in that year. That's what we're using right now for the expense assumptions. And we'll talk about this more later. We did slightly change our paratransit forecast for next fiscal year. We had a couple more months of actuals that we could look at, and we've revised that service level down slightly based on what we've seen the last couple of months. So this will ripple through all of our expense assumptions as well, these service levels. Moving on to our personnel budget. So we are planning on about 1,700 full-time equivalents next year in our budget. That's an increase of 5 next year as of right now for 5 construction safety flag person FTEs. We're still finalizing this. We potentially have one more IT addition to here to this budget for next year. So, but this is what's built into the current draft. Of those 1,700 employees, 77% are in representative groups. All those groups do have current collective bargaining agreements in place. So those wages increases in place for that groups are between 3.25 and 4.25% plus step increases as well. And then the non-represented groups, about 23% of the employees, they receive, the assumption is a 4% merit increase and a 1% bonus, performance improvement program. Those are both consistent with the current fiscal year. When you run all that through, it's an increase of about $5.3 million in wages or 5.5%. There's also additional operator hours in the next year's budget to account for the service level changes. That's why it's a little bit higher than the 4% range of wage increases that you're seeing. And we do have a high overtime assumption still again next year, like we do currently for the mid-year. Moving on to the fringe benefit side, the pension plan costs in total are increasing by about $900,000 or 3%. Our raw pension plan costs are increasing by about $2 million between the CalPERS side and the San Diego Transit internal side, but that's being offset by the pension obligation bond principal payment. Our very last bond payment is next fiscal year. It's much lower than the current fiscal year. So that's decreasing by about $1 million. And then we'll have some savings again in FY25 when we have no payment at all. On the healthcare side, we have our calendar year 23 rates in place. We are still assuming a 10% increase for calendar year 24. And then you can see the large increase here of $4 million. That's due to the savings we're realizing in FY23 through the disbanding of the ATU and IBU healthcare trusts and moving those employees onto regular benefit programs. Other assumptions here are our workers' compensation costs were very high in fiscal year 23. We're sort of projecting that to come down to more historical norms next year. So that assumption is decreasing by $1.1 million. So in total, we are increasing the benefit line by $3.8 million or 5.6% in this draft. Purchase transportation budget is increasing by almost $14 million or 15%. This is largely due to the planned service level increases, both on the fixed route bus side as well as the ADA paratransit side. All of our contract rates are in place. We do have fixed costs increasing on the Transdev side, which is the fixed route bus side, by 3.4%. And the variable cost will increase on January 1 by 3.1%. But they also increased in December, if you recall, when we amended those contracts to deal with operator issues on those contracts as well. So there's an annualization there that makes the overall rate increase a little higher than 3.1%. On the First Transit side, that does a small amount of fixed route service for us and as well as the ADA service for us. There's a 4.1% increase in their fixed cost. And then the ADA rate is a per hour rate. It's increasing by 2.1% over the current amended rate. And then minibus will increase by 4.6% per mile over their amended FY23 rate. In other outside services, security costs are projected to increase by $1.5 million or 12.1%. That is no additional service on the street. It is just for contractual rate increases. That contract was also amended recently, and then there'll be another rate increase in January of next year. So those rate increases are built into this draft. Our repair and maintenance costs are increasing by almost $3 million. Those are the projects that we talked about at the last meeting where we didn't get it started in time in FY23 and it's rolling into FY24 on the rail side. Other outside services costs are increasing by almost $2 million or 10%. Part of that is some facility upgrades for bus operations. The other piece of that is a full year of Pronto operations and maintenance costs, where the current fiscal year only has half a year included in that budget. So in total, outside services are increasing by $6.3 million or 15.4% in this draft. Energy assumptions are also impacted by the service level increases. We are projecting decreases in both electricity and natural gas, primarily due to the cost of the natural gas commodity. On the electricity side, the commodity rates right now, we get our electricity from a third party and not through SDG&E, through the direct access program, similar to the community choice program that's in place. So we're projecting right now a 9% decrease. We'll get additional numbers on that in the next week or so. So we're hoping that that comes down a little farther than 9%. But as of right now, that's what we're having. That's the last numbers we received. The other piece of our electricity costs is from SDG&E. And it's actually about 2/3 of our cost for electricity comes from SDG&E, just for transmission and demand. And those costs continue to rise. We're projecting another 10% increase there next year. So that's sort of offsetting the savings we're seeing on the electricity commodity side. And we're only seeing a little bit of a savings on the electricity side. Natural gas is a much different story. As we talked about in the mid-year meeting, we bumped up that budget extremely high due to the cost of natural gas, particularly in January and then also in February as well. So we're hoping for a much more normal year, and not a normal year where we get back to $3, hoping for a normal year where it's only $8, you know? So that right now, it's about a 51% decrease from what we had currently booked for FY23 versus what we're looking at for next year. But again, we're looking at that one very closely as well. We should get some more numbers from the Department of Energy soon, and also from our provider on that side. Similarly with electricity, we also do pay SG&E pieces just to get us the gas, get the gas to us. We do expect additional rate increases on that side as well. No real changes to our gas and propane assumptions. This powers not only our paratransit, some of our paratransit and minibus fleet, but also our non-revenue vehicles. So in total, we're seeing a savings here of $4.6 million, or almost 9%. And that is despite higher levels of service as well. Other assumptions to discuss, materials and supplies is very flat year over year. Our risk management insurance premiums are going up substantially for the new period that starts here in April. So we've built that into this rest of this year and next year's budgets. So that's an increase of about $1.3 million just because of insurance premium increases. We are expecting additional fair material costs next year, so we have increased that by about $350,000. Which is driving up this G&A number by about $500,000. And then again, pension obligation will be our last interest payment as well. So we'll see savings this current fiscal year, and then that number will be zero the following year. So in total, for our other expenses, we're seeing about a $1.6 million increase, or almost 5%. So here's the overall expense summary. It's not pretty. It's $26 million of expense increases, or almost 7%. And part of that is additional service levels as well, but we also have had a number of contractual rate increases this current year that is making the overall cost of business a little bit higher as well. So our revenues were increasing by $10.7 million, or 3.1%. Expenses are increasing by $26 million. So we are projecting a larger deficit for next fiscal year, going from $37 million for the amended budget to $53 million. Based on this draft. We do have stimulus funding to balance that still, but it is a much larger deficit, and sort of as we expected. So we wanted to talk about the structural deficit again, like we did at the last meeting, and we did a lot more work on our projection for FY25, and we actually went all the way out to FY31 and did a very in-depth projection based on this level of expenses, the $4 and $6 billion, based on that service levels. So starting from that starting point, we projected it out all the way through FY31, what we think commodities are going to do, what we think wages are going to do, what we think all the different categories. CPI is one that's sort of harder to predict, but we put some assumptions around that as well, and came up with this top chart is what we see the deficits are looking like. So it goes from 53 million to almost 60 million and stays around there because we do have some expected operating revenue growth in there as well. And then it gets to 60 million in the out years before finally getting to about 80 million when we have that transnet deficit issue in FY31. So as of right now, based on our level of stimulus funding, we'll have funding to balance this into FY27, basically into the start of FY27. So we talked about the different ways we can address this structural deficit at the last meeting, and there's three that are really that being implemented fairly quickly if we wanted to lower these overall deficits now and make the reserves last even longer. So under, just taking these three things and just looking at how it impacts those deficits going out for a few years. So first one is not adding back all the service. We have a service level right now based on our operators requirement, we've lowered those service levels. But if we sort of kept that level of service in place and only making changes that really need to be changed from a customer perspective, we could have additional savings over the next few years if we kept those same service levels. So this bottom chart, this first chart here is what would happen if we kept FY23's, primarily FY23 service levels in place over the next 7 years. So we see a little bit more savings of, I don't know if you can see my mouse, a little bit of savings from for the current year, because most of the assumed service changes were in January of next year. There's not a giant savings in FY24, but there is a significant savings in FY25 and FY26 going out. But overall, that's still just doing that one change. It just makes the deficit last a little bit longer into FY27. It doesn't really even get us a whole year. So the next one we modeled was just looking at if we enforce fares on the trolley and did that right away. We think it's about $6 million a year that could be immediately impacted if more people tapped on the trolleys. So you see immediate impact, and then expenses start growing from there. Again, this one by itself just buys you a few months in FY27. It doesn't really stretch the needle at all. The last one was stretching capital dollars, and we'll touch more about the capital program next. It's not that we have surplus of capital dollars at all. It's just that we're basically been doing everything on a schedule, and there's scheduled to do it and then really have to do it are sort of two different things. And we think we could probably save money in capital if we really had to and stretch this money out. So that we weren't planning on doing until FY25, but you can see there's savings in FY25 compared to the original one. And then for going out from there, about $10 million a year, we think. Even that, again, it just moves the needle a little bit, a few months in FY27. So you really have to do a combination of things. So if you do all three of these things, you're able to do that. It does make the reserves last into FY29 versus into FY27, and does get that gap at that point in time down to under $40 million versus being close to $60 million where it is in the other assumption, in our normal assumptions. So just wanted to present that to you as a discussion point. If we want to start working on this now, and we do have a few years away before we have to get there, but it's a big number when we get there of a gap to address. So the next step is present primarily the same overview to the board on April 20th. And then we need to finalize all of our assumptions, primarily on service levels and then passenger levels as well. And basically, hopefully we get some either favorable news or at least current status quo news from March's passenger results. We want to take one more look at energy credit prices to see if we can add dollars there and generate additional revenue, project additional revenue in that line. And then one more look at the energy prices as well, because we just think there should be some more savings on the electricity side. And then we'll prepare the full draft of the budget and the budget book and bring it back to this committee on April 27th before we have a public hearing on May 18th. And this is just informational. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Before we get into committee discussion, clerk, can you verify whether there are any members of the public wishing to speak?
We have no public comments, Chair.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on to comments from committee members. As was mentioned, this is an informational item. Are there any members? Councilmember Goebel?
Thank you, Chair Moreno. I think I saw in there that we're using $85 million of federal stimulus money in the operating budget, but there's a deficit of only 53 million. So that's a gap of around 30 million. Is that because we decided to accelerate some of the stimulus funds into the operating budget?
No, we're only using stimulus funds to balance the operating budget, and it is, in the attachments. Oh, in the attachments, yes, we're trying to draw additional federal stimulus funding and then put it in a reserve It doesn't really change how long that stimulus funding lasts. It's just a matter of getting it out of the Fed's hands and getting it into our hands. So we don't lose it if the case there's any sort of debt.
So it is some acceleration of,
Acceleration, but it's,
instead of using reserves.
yeah, we'll use it the same way and we'll put the difference into reserves.
Got it. Okay. The $8 million more in passenger revenue, is that from, it sounds like that's not really from fare enforcement. That's more for restored service. Is that correct?
It's from passenger growth.
Passenger growth, which would have to come from restored service levels or more passengers in existing lines? Do you have a sense of the blend of that?
Yeah, we've been, we've had this last year, we've had mid-coast ridership growth, we've had youth ridership growth, but even our base adult and SDM ridership has grown by about 10% year over year. And it's because people are going back to work. So there's still a lot of people that aren't working 100% of the time in an office, but has steadily been growing over the last 18 months. So we're hoping that piece does continue for the next fiscal year.
Okay. If we have to raise the starting wage rates from $22 to get these drivers that we need to restore service, does it have an impact on the rest of the wages, or are they locked in due to a collective bargaining agreement?
So for instance, it wouldn't really impact management per se, unless it was, for instance, somebody that went from bus driver ranks to supervisor ranks, because then they would be in management. Those then we want them to be making a little bit more than what they were making as a bus driver to convince them to take on that leadership position. With regard to all of the bargaining units, we would want to, it doesn't move just because we added money to the wages of bus drivers. We did not increase the wages for the others as well. So it's not required that you increase the wages for all. I will say that we are seeing quite a bit of movement on hiring in the bus driver ranks. So we are feeling a little bit more positive lately.
Okay. My final question is on the energy rates. We had talked about analyzing the cost of locking in rates with future contract. And can I assume you looked at that and decided, no, the cost of securing that is more than going bare with what the market has to offer?
We're still looking at that and we'll bring more about that the next meeting. We want to wait as late as possible because the natural gas cycle is right now they're still depleting the storage levels, and then soon they start adding to the storage levels. And basically when you get to that point, it sort of makes it easier for them to guess what their next year is going to look like. So I'm sort of waiting on that before I get those guesses from our vendors. And then we'll look at that and we'll bring that back to you at the next meeting.
Okay, so we might have that information.
We'll
before we
definitely
lock in.
discuss it at the next meeting. And then we'll have the actual analysis as well.
Sounds good.
And excuse me, and even after we come back to the Budget Development Committee at the next meeting, that doesn't prohibit us to sometime within the fiscal year to, if we see an opportunity, we could lock in rates at, within the fiscal year if it presents an opportunity to do so. Sorry, Larry Marinisi, CFO here at MTS.
Thank you, Chair. That answers my questions. My comments would be how long we can make this deficit or the ARPA funds last. Clearly, if we do 3, we get a couple more years of those funds out of it, but it requires some sacrifices. And I think that's the question before us and the board is, do we make those sacrifices now or do we make them later? One of the concerns is if we restore service levels, we know that new routes actually are subsidized. We don't recover all the costs every time we add a new route. So there is certainly some social justice issues about where those routes are and what's restored and what's cut, and we want to be fair. But at the same time, we have to be mindful about trying to make our dollar stretch as best as we can. So certainly a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. Council President Elo Rivera.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the report. Really appreciate it. Really, and I really appreciate the kind of the broad overview and the details here. I had a question related to kind of in the weeds at the programmatic level. To what extent what we're looking at here includes the Pronto Extend program, if at all?
Yes, it does include that.
Okay, so that's factored in.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. I think there's the benefits for the riders, which are incredible. I also do think that there's the positive momentum that the Pronto Extend program has offered, Youth Opportunity Passes has offered, I think has been really good for kind of the brand of MTS and for trolley and bus ridership. I think it's created an excitement about those forms of transportation. And I've heard, anecdotally from adults, either those with young people who are utilizing those passes or with other family members, that they are kind of being made more aware again of our system as a result of these programs running. And so I'm glad to hear that that's factored in. I think it's I know from having heard from young folks how impactful it is. And so we're very glad to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the comments. I'd like to take a few moments to give my comments. First of all, I appreciate staff for crunching the numbers to see what effect suspending services expansion, increased fare enforcement, and deferring needed capital improvements might have on the longevity of our deficit reserve. Obviously, the answers are not very encouraging. If we make these cuts, I think we simply postpone the date that the reserves runs out by a year or two, is something that was discussed. And I think this is cold comfort, as it's not a real solution to our structural budget deficit. I'll point out that two of the options would have very negative impacts on our plans to boost ridership. Postponing service expansions that were planned for fiscal year 24 might sound like not a big deal in abstract, but the Iris Rapid is one of these service expansions, and I don't want us to lose out on the potential ridership gains that we do that it will bring forward. Likewise, stretching capital dollars may sound benign, but this means we would delay funding for Division 6, which is now called the Clean Transit Advancement Campus. And doing so will severely delay our rollout of zero emission buses and would inhibit our ability to add more service quickly in the future. Regarding security, I simply don't believe that this is a realistic revenue measure. If I understand the presentation correctly, staff simply assumes that by declaring that we're enforcing fares, we would cause any rider with stored value to tap on every ride. And respectfully, there's no evidence that our existing security contract could deliver this level of performance. So I wouldn't want to rely on that option. Instead of these three proposals, I will suggest two alternatives. First off, we should absolutely seek more funding from the state of California to support transit. I do have, before I get into that, if we can go back to page 19, which was our expenses, how much of the purchase transportation funding, how much of those funds spent are due to requirements from the state of California?
On the operating budget side, I don't think anything it's all on the capital side.
It's all on the capital side? Okay.
Yeah, there is some electricity for buses. We don't have that many buses right now, but otherwise it's all on the capital side for the zero emission bus.
Okay, so page 19, purchased transportation.
Yeah, none
nothing.
of that relates to.
Okay, just wanted to clear that out.
Okay.
Okay, so back to, as we all know, transit agencies across California are struggling. We're not the only one. The San Francisco Bay Area Planning and Urban Research Association in a report last month found that the state of California has provided only 5% to 22% of the largest transit agency operations funding, while larger systems in other states receive about 28 to 50% of their operating funds from their state government. This suggests that there's a lot of room for growth for us, and growth demand, I think, is a better statement. And the state is struggling with a deficit now, but its financial situation could be very different in fiscal year 27. So I would make sure that we continue to push for that. And moreover, to reiterate a point that my colleague Monica Montgomery Step has made. TDA reform could be a way for the state to help out transit systems, transit agencies like MTS without incurring large new cost. We've also reviewed a report from the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. It was published last February that argues that reform to the TDA's fare box recovery and the consumer price index eligibility requirements could provide more operating support for transit agencies. Second, apart from seeking additional state funding, and I just want to put a pin to the previous item that we had. That's why I wanted Mr. Pimentel to come here, and he will be here at the next meeting to give our committee kind of a lay of the land of TDA and, you know, how it works and where we can push and pull. But, you know, also I think it behooves us to look outside to see what other agencies in the federal landscape, what they are doing and what they are requiring. But second, additionally, seeking state funding, MTS always has the option of attempting to seek more local funding through a revenue measure. I don't want to cut services or capital improvement projects before exploring this project. We shouldn't assume that voters would prefer devastating cuts to transit over additional local revenue. With the right timing and preparation, voters could very well choose to avoid these cuts by supporting additional revenue. But in summary, my recommendation would be to keep our assumptions on service levels the same and pursue the two alternatives that I've outlined. You know, when I was briefed on this item, I do recognize that TDA is not going to change overnight, right? It's been this way for a long time, but I absolutely think that we, not only as a committee here, but as an agency, should be really demanding and pushing harder on the funding, especially when seeing what other agencies across the nation are doing. That was a big shocker to me. So that concludes my comments. I see some red light. I see a red light on. Do we want to go back to you? Okay, Councilmember Goble.
Thank you, Chair. You know, it's interesting when you talk about the TDA reform, because this is not just an MTS problem. This is probably a Bay Area problem. This is probably an LA problem. I just got to believe the state or the federal government have to do something, because we're all going to be in the red very soon. And I support the efforts to go at the state level. When you say you support current levels of service, do you mean not restoring service, or mean keeping the same levels of service today?
I would like to move forward with what the plan at hand was. So my understanding is we were restoring services to pre-COVID, and I want to continue with that agenda, if you will.
Understood.
It
Thank you
would-
for the clarity.
And it really relates to once we get the bus operators back up and we can provide that service. So that's what we budgeted, because that's where we estimate we will get to the fully staffed.
Unless you and I get on a bus and start driving, I would agree with that statement. We definitely want bus drivers to be the ones driving.
I
the
would
buses.
not
So, yeah,
recommend me
no.
behind the wheel of a bus.
You know, I would recommend me. I think in another lifetime, I might have been a bus driver. But with that, are there any other comments or questions from the committee? Okay, thank you. So thank you for the presentation. We're gonna move on to item number 6, which is fiscal year 2024 capital improvement projects. And we have Mr. Thompson here.
Thank you. For this one, I am joined by Eric Chang. He's our Transit Asset Management Program Manager, and he oversees the capital budget. For this, we want to talk more about the overall guiding principle. We do have board policy 65 that is around transit asset management. And it states that MTS is committed to effectively managing its transit assets and maintain its system in a state of good repair to support safe, efficient, and reliable transit services across the organization. Now, this board policy came about is there were new regulations at the federal level. There's always been existing regulations for the Federal Railroad Association and the California Public Utilities Commission, but we did have to comply with some new federal level regulations a number of years ago, and that's when this policy came about. But we've always prioritize capital at MTS and making sure we are keeping our system in a state of good repair. That was nothing new for MTS, but some of this board policy stuff was. So our base project prioritization and other capital managements are based on not only the asset criticality to operations, but its condition and performance over the recent time, factoring in the available funding and the safety considerations as well. We try to keep that on schedule and keep our system in a state of good repair. And we always do a 20-year look ahead for our capital budget, and just on state of good repair needs over 20 years is over $2 billion. It's 120 million a year just by itself, just to keep our current system in a state of good repair. And the large portion of that is in revenue vehicles alone. So to develop our CIP, this process began last September with requests for projects. And at that time, each department looks not only at their 5-year need, but also at a 20-year need and updates that, so we can keep an eye on those projects that don't happen that frequently. So they update that, they get their 5-year requests together, and then they prioritize their list of projects. And then our team consolidates that list, and then the whole group gets together to meet to discuss the overall priority list. So it's a collaborative process between bus ops and rail ops, admin, and as well as Sandag as well. So each committee member will look at their areas and advocate for their projects. Projects with safety and our operational needs are generally prioritized one. So once the committee finalizes those numbers, the CEO approves their prioritization, and all priority projects, again, we're able to at least partially funded this next fiscal year. That list, the project list, is also subject to analysis based on social equity principles, and there were no disproportionate impacts to low-income or minority populations. So the overall list over the 5 years is $1.1 billion in projects. So summarized in the table on the right, $300 million is bus revenue vehicles, about $85 million is rail revenue vehicles over these 5 years, $73 million in facility and construction projects, $200 million in rail infrastructure projects, $45 million in other equipment and installations, and then we have $400 million of other initiatives that aren't state of good repair related also in this budget. That $400 million is primarily related to a zero emission bus infrastructure and the new facility. But we also do have some other expansion type things included in that other initiative bucket as well. So again, $1.1 billion over those 5 years. For this next fiscal year, we have $175 million available for capital. So we talked about this a little bit in the operating budget, how we share some of these revenue sources between capital and operations. So this is $108 million is our overall federal funding. It'll be offset by the preventive maintenance costs in the operating budget. We also get $15 million of regional surface transportation funding. That is through Sandag, and it funds our SD 100 trolley replacement. $43 million is our TDA share in the capital budget for next fiscal year. About $30 million is the STA formula share in the capital budget for next fiscal year. We also get another STA bucket of money for just specifically for state of good repair that has to go into capital. That is projected at $5 million for next year. We had some competitive grant awards through the Transit Intercity Rail Capital Program. It's about $10.1 million. It's an award from a few years ago. And you sort of have to program out when you're going to receive that money. So this is the money program for next fiscal year for that award. And then we have about $17.5 million of other revenue, includes IRS CNG credits, transfers from closed projects, and other discretionary grant programs. So in total, again, $175 million, $43 million of this is sort of one-time funding, either discretionary or just carryover type stuff, transfers. But we do have about $130 million of recurring funding in the capital budget. That $175 million is going to be programmed as follows: about $61 million for bus revenue vehicles, $22 million for rail revenue vehicles, about $11 million for facility and construction projects, $19 million for rail infrastructure projects, $5.5 million for other equipment installations, and then we're able to put $56 million towards our other initiatives. Again, primarily zero emission bus stuff. So we were The total request, the ask for fiscal year 24 was 218,063 projects in total. So we were only able to fund 80% of those requests. The majority of the funding does go to state grid repair with 68%, and 47% alone is just on revenue vehicles. So in total, we're able to fund 55 projects. We do have a detailed project listing in the attachment by these same categories. There's also some short descriptions in attachment C. We basically will stick to the high level category discussion, sort of discuss what each category is and then how much funding is there, but there is a detailed listing of the projects by these same categories in the attachment. So moving on to the projects, bus revenue vehicles, again, is usually the largest capital project every single year. We do have a fleet plan that includes 764 vehicles. And you can see the type of vehicles in this chart, how long they typically last, and also the cost to replace them as well. We have our 40-foot buses, both regular and battery electric. We have our 60-foot buses, both CNG and battery electric. Our commuter express fleet is 24 buses that were just replaced a couple of years ago. And then we have two flavors of smaller mini buses like the picture on the bottom right, both for our fixed route minibus service and also our ADA minibus service as well. So again, it's 750 buses. We replace 50 to 70 every single year. So we sort of have to put money away every year to sort of smooth out that funding requirement. So this next fiscal year, again, we're planning 61 million. We are planning to purchase 51 40-foot buses, 13 of which will be battery electric buses, 5 60-foot buses, and 7 mini buses. And then for the out years, we have 60 million a year to try to smooth out that funding requirement every single year as well. So we have 300 million in total need over this 5 years, 61 million being funded for the current year. Our rail fleet, we have 168 vehicles in that fleet. Those last a lot longer, so the funding cycle is a little bit more chaotic, not as regular as on the bus side. We are currently replacing the 52 SD100s. We've been working on that project for a number of years now. And after that, we will be working on the next series that needs to be replaced, is the SD7 series that went into service in 2004. So we are funding $22 million for the current fiscal year. We have another $31 million to fund next fiscal year, and then the SD100 replacement project will be finally complete. And then right after that, we will need to start funding the SD7s, so we think $11 million starting in FY26 to save for that program as well. So for rail revenue vehicles, about $85 million total need for the 5 years. Looking at facility and construction projects, this is all of our operating facilities, which includes all of our bus divisions as well as the trolley yard as well, and all those all those buildings. So it includes not just the building stuff, but the fueling facilities, the maintenance equipment built into those buildings, the yards around the buildings, those type of things for all of those divisions. And we also, this category also includes all this stuff that we need to do to our passenger facilities. Not only the major transit centers themselves, but also the amenities of the transit centers like the shelters or escalators or elevators, things of that nature, parking lots as well. So for this, the total request over the 4 years was $73 million. The current fiscal year, we had about $13 million in requests. That's 17 projects in total. 14 will be able to be funded for about $11 million. For the maintenance facilities, it's about $7 million, and then passenger facilities, about $4 million of funding for this current fiscal year. Again, the full list of the projects is included in attachment B. We put one example picture here that at the building A, there's a wheelchairing machine for the trolleys that needs to be replaced. So that's one of the projects that's being funded this current fiscal year, the picture on the right. The next category is rail infrastructure projects. It does take a large capital investment to get a rail system in place. I mean, we saw that with Midcoast was $2 billion alone, and we've invested nearly $3 billion over the last 10 years for that, and also for the Blue Line rehabilitation. All that investment does require significant upkeep as well on an ongoing basis. So we basically break the rail infrastructure into two pieces. First is track, with anything that directly relates to the physical rail. It includes the rail and ties, It includes where the grade crossing is. That's what these pictures on the right are, is a picture of a before and after of a grade crossing improvement. It also includes a special track work where tracks go together basically, or crossovers and things of that nature. The other type of rail infrastructure project is our maintenance of wayside. This includes all the bridges, elevated track, and drainage around the right of way. It also includes the electrification of the entire system, the overhead catenary, and the substations that power the trolleys. It also includes the signaling as well. So for next fiscal year, 17 projects were submitted. 14 projects were funded, 3 were not funded. It's $19 million in total, basically almost evenly split between track and MOW. And the overall request was 204 million over the 5 years. So we do have some work to do the next few fiscal years. Other equipment installation projects are things like smaller equipment on the bus and rail operations. It's also maintenance and cleaning equipment for both sides as well. It also includes all the IT infrastructure, not only the systems, but the storage, the servers, and the network equipment as well. That needs to be refreshed on an ongoing basis. So for this, there were 14 projects submitted, primarily on the admin side. 12 projects were funded, 2 were not funded. And again, it's about $6 million in total. The overall need over 5 years is about $45 million for this category of projects. This next slide rolls up all the stated good repair categories. You can see we were able to fund 118 million in stated good repair projects for fiscal year 24 with this CIP. And we're also able, and the actual need over the next 5 years is a little bit higher in the next couple of years. So overall 707,000 need over 5 years. It's over $141 million a year in the out years. And that alone exceeds what we see as our recurring funding over the next 5 years. So we do have significant work ahead of us on the capital side. Other initiatives in the capital, it's primarily the zero emission bus initiative that's being driven by the innovative clean transit regulations. So in order to comply with this, we do need to not only retrofit all of our existing facilities, we also are probably going to need another facility to be able to go fully electric across the agency. So we've been funding this Clean Transit Advancement Campus or Division 6 for a few years now. We are planning on putting another $37 million towards that project as well, and another additional $1 million for design. And then the rest of this funding is going to be towards the existing divisions that we have. Putting overhead charging at all of our existing facilities. So in total, we're funding $52 million towards this. Overall need for this type of stuff over the next 5 years is $388 million. Majority of that is in the new division, but even without that, it's $88 million of stuff just for our existing facilities, just in this one period of time. Because it's going to be, once we touch all these facilities, we have to go back and keep adding more capacity at each one of them. So it's going to be an ongoing process over the full 20 years. There were 4 other projects submitted for FY24 that are neither stated good repair or zero emission bus related. One was a social equity listening tour project implementation. We're funding another $2 million for that. We're funding an additional $1.3 million for the 12th and Imperial Transit expansion downstairs, and also another additional $500,000 towards the Green Line double check project that is also downstairs. So this next slide rolls up the entire 5 years. It looks at the overall project need, which is $1.1 billion, majority of which again is in stated good repair. And then it looks at the available revenues that we've identified, both recurring and non-recurring over that period of time, about $736 million over this 5-year period. We do have a substantial deficit on the capital side of $388 million, and we're about 66% funded. So with that large gap, we do see challenges ahead meeting our unconstrained list of projects. With that significant shortfall in funding, we sort of prioritize the projects in this following fashion. Stated repair has always been the first priority. Keeping the system safe and reliable has always been priority 1 at MTS. The next is the ZEB infrastructure at the existing bus facilities. We will fund those projects next because that's needed more urgently. And then after that, we will fund the Clean Transit Advancement Campus, sort of that will allow us to do our full ZEB transition. It would also allow us to accelerate any ZEB transition if the money was available. And then also allow us to expand service if we ever need to expand service. So that's sort of how we've broken down the objectives going forward. And again, with this gap, we're always being very aggressive on any sort of grant program, any competitive grant program or discretionary grant program, and also with the new earmark campaigns that have become back in the fashion on the federal level as well. And with that, it brings me to the staff recommendation is that the Budget Development Committee forward a recommendation that the Board of Directors approve the fiscal year 24 capital improvement program with the estimated federal and non-federal funding levels, which is attachments A and B. As the federal appropriation figures are finalized and our other project funding sources available, allow the Chief Executive Officer to identify and adjust projects with adjusted funding levels. Recommend that the San Diego Association of Governments, or SANDAG, Board of Directors approve the submittal of the federal section 5307, 5337, and 5339 applications for the MTS fiscal year 24 CIP. And recommend that the SANDAG Board of Directors approve amendment number 3 of the 2023 Regional Transportation Improvement Program, or RTIP, in accordance with the fiscal year 24 CIP recommendations. With that, we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mike, for the presentation. Clerk, do we have any members of the public wishing to speak?
We have no public comments.
Okay, wonderful. And I'm going to move on to comments from committee members. Councilmember Goble.
Thank you, Chair Marino. The cost of materials in the supply chain has really been wild the past couple of years. How have you factored that into a 5-year plan of cost of materials?
We typically don't try to do that over the 5-year period. We basically look at existing levels for the current fiscal year and sort of project it out there. We do inflate the buses every year because we have CPI inflation in there for that. But for all the other infrastructure stuff, we just don't know what it's going to look like when you actually go out to bid. So we don't have the managers try to play that. We just sort of put level dollars in place for the rest of the projects
Based on what you know today?
based on what we know today.
Okay,
Correct.
so world events and supply chain disruptions and shortages and things could have an impact we don't know yet.
And they definitely will. Yeah. I mean, we're funding this current fiscal year. We're not as concerned with those 5-year forecasts. I mean, we'll address it next year when we get to funding for next year for FY25.
Do I get a sense that a lot of the capital requirements are to meet the state mandates for greenhouse gas reductions?
Most of the capital requirement is basically just rehabbing and replacing things that need to be replaced. It's only that zero emission bus stuff that is really related to greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. And certainly, I think the public might not be aware a lot of these funds coming from the state and the federal government have strings on them. Sometimes you can only use it for this
Correct.
or use it or lose it, things like that. So we don't have full discretion over how these funds are used always, do we?
No, we don't.
Okay, all right. Good for the public to know as well. Thank you.
Thank you. This is an action item, so if I may have a motion in a second. Wonderful motion by Council President Sean Nilo. Thank you, Acting Chair. So there is a motion on the floor in a second. Anybody else wishing to speak? So we will go to a voice vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed, please say nay. Are there any abstentions? The motion carries unanimously. So we're going to move on to item number 7, which is the next meeting. Our next meeting will be on April 27th, 2023 at 2 p.m. And moving on to item number 8, which is the adjournment. Thank you all for attending and for your input today. I will call the MTS Budget Committee meeting officially adjourned. Thank you.